Motherhood in the Middle Ages. In the twilight of the medieval centuries, between the years 500 and 1500 of the Christian era, motherhood was much more than a biological event. It was a spiritual journey, a test of faith, and, for many women, the most dangerous moment of their lives. Between the walls of castles and the huts of the countryside, two distinct realities shaped the experience of motherhood. On one side, noble ladies surrounded by care. On the other, common women facing the dangers of pregnancy with few resources beyond faith and solidarity. This is the story of medieval motherhood, a narrative of contrasts, where birth could mean the continuity of a lineage or the struggle for survival of a peasant family. Women of all social classes shared the same fears, hopes, and, often, the same tragic fate. Pregnancy among the nobility. Upon discovering pregnancy, the life of a noble lady was transformed. The routine of social obligations gave way to a carefully prepared period of seclusion. Rooms were adapted, windows sealed against drafts, braziers to keep the environment warm, carpets covering the stone floors. Nutrition was supervised: red meat for strength, sweet fruits for a gentle temperament in the baby, wines with herbs in small doses. Experienced midwives, many with knowledge transmitted through generations, combined empirical knowledge with medical references from monasteries and universities. They knew how to deal with complications, birth positions, and used medicinal herbs. But no amount of care could dispel fear. Maternal mortality was high. Pregnant women surrounded themselves with amulets, gold crosses, sacred fabrics, saints' relics. Each object represented a plea for divine protection. Prayers were constant. They invoked the Virgin Mary, Saint Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of women in childbirth, Saint Anne. A confessor was always nearby, as death was a real possibility. Pregnancy among the common people. For peasant women, artisans, and urban workers, pregnancy meant continuing to work until the end. The family's survival depended on every pair of hands. They harvested grain with large bellies, carried water, cared for children, and prepared meals. There were no substitutes. Each day without work was a risk of hunger. Childbirth was conducted by local midwives, usually elderly women with vast experience. They used chamomile to calm, rue to strengthen, rosemary to purify. They knew positions and practical techniques. It was ancestral knowledge, passed from woman to woman. Female solidarity was vital. Neighbors cared for older children, prepared food, and provided support. It was a protection network formed by common experience. But the lack of resources made everything more risky. Infections, hemorrhages, complicated births were fatal. Many children grew up orphaned, raised by grandmothers or stepmothers. The moment of birth. Childbirth was a moment of universal tension where life and death crossed dangerously. Faith, hope, and fear marked this event. In castles, special rooms were prepared. Tapestries on the walls, braziers, pure wax candles, fine sheets. Everything to ensure an environment conducive to birth. Among the common people, birth could happen in the kitchen floor or outdoors if necessary. There was no luxury, but there was collective wisdom. The midwife was the central figure. Besides technical knowledge, she had spiritual respect. She knew what to do, when to intervene, how to relieve pain. She used sharp knives, heated oils, and specific herbs. Some knew that washing hands and instruments prevented infections, even without understanding why. They prayed all the time. Saint Margaret, protect us. Virgin Mary, intercede. Saint Ramon Nontus, give us strength. Midwives knew specific litanies for critical moments. Amulets and relics were common. Crosses, sacred fabrics, stones with special shapes. Everything was spiritually mobilized to protect mother and baby. Still, tragedies were frequent. Hemorrhages, infections, obstructed births. Often, only prayer remained. When mother and baby survived, there was celebration. Bells rang, neighbors brought gifts, and prayers of thanksgiving echoed. It was a victory against the odds. Raising children. Surviving childbirth was just the beginning. Raising children reflected the family's material conditions and the religious beliefs of the time. Breastfeeding was essential. The church recommended that mothers breastfeed their children. It was seen as a sacred duty. Among the common people, there was no alternative. Among nobles, however, wet nurses were common. Healthy peasant women were hired to nurse noble babies, creating deep bonds with the children. Education varied drastically. Children of nobles were prepared from an early age for their social role. Boys learned warfare, management, honor. Girls, embroidery, music, and household administration. Among the common people, childhood was short. 5-year-old children already helped at home or in the fields. Education was practical. Girls learned to cook and sew, boys to work with their fathers. All children, regardless of class, received intense religious education. They prayed from a young age and learned about salvation and damnation. Mothers were primarily responsible for this spiritual formation. Motherhood in the Middle Ages was deeply linked to spirituality. The figure of the Virgin Mary dominated the female imagination. At the same time, an unattainable model and source of comfort. Mary was the ideal mother, pure, devoted, suffering. An unattainable ideal, but venerated. The pain of childbirth was interpreted as punishment for Eve's original sin. In pain you will give birth to children, said the Bible. This theological view generated urgency around baptism. Babies who died without the sacrament would go to limbo. Midwives were trained to perform emergency baptisms. Many children were baptized days after birth. Other saints offered more human models. Saint Anna, invoked by those who wished to become pregnant. Saint Monica, symbol of maternal perseverance. Mothers created their own spirituality, focused on protecting their children. They developed specific prayers, particular devotions and practices that, although not recognized by the Church, emotionally sustained thousands of women. Motherhood in the Middle Ages was a universal but unequal experience. While some had access to care and protection, the majority faced pregnancy and childbirth with courage and mutual help. The Church profoundly shaped the experience of motherhood, between guilt and comfort. Still, it was a space of resistance and female power, where women created support networks, practical wisdom, and their own spirituality. These stories, preserved in chronicles, testaments, and oral traditions, show that behind great historical events, there were always women fighting to give life and protect their children. Medieval motherhood was above all an act of faith. Faith in life, in the future, and in the possibility that, despite everything, it would always be worth fighting for one more generation, for one more chance of love in a brutal and unpredictable world.